Alrighty, well, it's that time. We'll get started. I'd like to start off by welcoming everybody who's tuning into this panel titled Global Leadership Crisis. And my name is Mariella Million, and I am the operations coordinator at the Resolution Project. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ryan Whalen. And I'd like to just, outline his bio. So Ryan works at the intersection of policy, politics, and social impact. He currently serves as a senior advisor at Bloomberg Philanthropies, where he leads programs to support cities in their response to COVID-19 and climate change. Ryan previously served in senior roles for the Rockefeller Foundation, New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and United States Senator Charles Schumer on the political campaign at the national, state, and local levels. He is a graduate of Trinity College in NYU and serves on a number of boards and advisory councils, most importantly, the Resolution Advisory Board. Welcome, Ryan, and welcome to the panelists and the fellows tonight. And I'll hand it over to you.
Mariella, thank you. And everyone who's here for Resolve 2020. This is one of my favorite nights of the year. And in particular, I want to thank and applaud the entire Resolution team for taking what is always a very captivating and enjoyable in-person event and making it such an interactive and rewarding virtual one. So just as you've been doing all year during this pandemic, congratulations and thank you for all that you are doing. Now, I think none of us need to be reminded that our world is in a time of crisis, and that sadly that crisis will not stop when this pandemic is over. We've all seen how economic inequality, social injustice, climate change, and sadly so many other crises and long-term stresses on our world have put enormous strain on our communities, our economies, and our individual experiences. Leadership have permitted and exacerbated these crises. To meet this moment, I believe, and I suspect many of you on this panel as well, believe that we need a new spirit of leadership that will transcend these crises. But tonight, I do come with a message of hope. The Resolution community is an embodiment of the kind of leadership that our world needs, not only to recover from this pandemic, but to create a fundamentally new kind of future. And so in this panel, we will hear from two remarkable young leaders. We'll learn about their personal leadership journeys and also how young leaders can catalyze change. So with that, I will introduce both of our panelists were selected to be Resolution Fellows in 2018 and are both doing incredible work to change the world. First, Mussab Ali is currently a first-year student at Harvard Law School. He is from Jersey City, New Jersey, where he is an elected member of the Jersey City Board of Education. And he is the founder of the Ali Leadership Institute that is focused on training the next generation of activists, organizers, and grassroots leaders. And Vongai Mlambo is from Zimbabwe. She currently lives in Santa Clara, California, and is studying medicine at Stanford University, where she's also in her first year. She is the co-founder of CAMA, the College Admissions Mentors for Africa, which supports African high school students in pursuing global education opportunities with a focus on their personal and professional development. She also serves as the education chair for a medical student-led community-based vaccination program. And so with that, I'd like to turn the conversation over to our panelists. And I'll start by asking each of you to tell us a bit about your own personal leadership journeys and how you've been leading during COVID-19. Mlambo, I'll start with you. Vongai.
Hi, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I think my personal leadership journey would definitely start at the initiation of my social venture, which was born out of seeing the education inequities in my environment and how that we can leverage that using peer-to-peer mentorship, but also mentors that are older than us that can advise. And since then, I've also taken up leadership roles in my university when I was an undergraduate as vice president of the student government. And in COVID, that was particularly challenging just because of how international our university was, and the COVID-19 pandemic really hit different countries in various ways. And so it was about how do we support those students who have such diverse backgrounds, but still give them the most support that we can as a governance structure, but also as part of the university itself. And really, I think my passion is also in education. And so I just did a lot of volunteering too, which is an awesome form of leadership that is under-recognized sometimes. I served as a tutor for 2 wonderful children who could no longer go to class and didn't really have the capacity to do streaming throughout the day, and just tutored them in math and science. And that was a beautiful relationship that I was grateful to cultivate during COVID-19.
That's great. And what you're describing in responding and pivoting to the moment is exactly what we all have needed in this world. And Mussab, can you likewise tell us about your journey and how it's manifested itself in COVID as well?
Sure. So to really talk about my journey, I guess I have to talk about, sort of my growing up and my childhood. So my family immigrated to Jersey City when I was 3 years old. And we were very lucky, moved to the greatest city in the world, at least in my opinion. I grew up around people from all over the world. I never really had this feeling of being a minority, right? I never really had the feeling of you were the odd man out, because everyone was kind of odd, right? Like everyone kind of came from a different background. And initially I thought, I wanted to do medicine. I wanted to grow up, be a doctor. And no offense to Vongai, but I realized, my pathway to service was going to be a little bit different. And so in 2016, there was a very heated presidential election. And at the time, I wanted to do something locally because I realized that, at the end of the day, like federal politics is, it's great. But the people who impact your life the most are the people in the day-to-day. And as one guy was mentioning, I think education is just such a critical part, especially in America, right? That sort of social mobility and economic mobility that education provides. I don't think there's any other vehicle like it. So I ran for my school board in 2016. Unfortunately, I didn't win, but then ran again in 2017 and got elected. And it has been a very tough time during COVID-19. I mean, trying to figure out reopening schools, trying to order Chromebooks and textbooks. I mean, you got to realize, every district around the country was trying to order Chromebooks at the same exact time. And so there was a massive global shortage. And so for months on end, we had no ability to get people access to the internet, no ability to give people access to computers. And this is, in a supposedly first world country where we have the highest standards for education. And so, that was part of what really helped me unravel, the sort of failing system that we have here. And also this recognition that we need to, rely on the global economy much more and start to recognize, how much we need to rely on other stakeholders around the world and internationally in order to make differences in our local communities.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think this leads us very naturally to my next question, which is, we've seen these significant leadership failures across the world and in so many different arenas. And so I'd love to hear your diagnoses of these failures. What are the biggest issues and challenges that you're seeing in global leadership today? And I definitely want to talk about some of how we respond to those and improve those, but I'll turn to the medical student first for the diagnosis on the problems we're facing right now.
Thank you. So actually, I think the problem is that the leaders are failing to diagnose problems themselves. So there's a focus on what are the superficial symptoms, as I would call them. So, for example, in this pandemic, there was an observation that, people of color are being impacted severely more than people that aren't of color. And that was like, we should definitely get them screened and treated. But really the underlying issue is the health disparities that exist between these two different communities. And we haven't attended to it for so long. And now that there's additional pressure on our system, it's exposing these disparities that have always been there. And so there's always a time for a short-term response, absolutely. But I think in order to build a more sustainable architecture of a country or a healthcare system or an education system, we really need to go back to the drawing board and almost rebuild the house, which is challenging and requires a sort of grit that I don't think I've been seeing a lot in leadership around the world. And that's also because they have a lot of image management to do too. But I don't think that should ever come at the cost of really solving the problems that we're encountering. I'll also tie this with a very tangible example. So in South Africa, during the COVID-19 pandemic, social distancing was kind of the key preventative measure. But in high density areas where, you know, being out on the street is your form of living, that's really hard to adhere by. And so you got these clusters of cases in these areas, but it's also difficult to say, oh, but that shouldn't have happened when we haven't given them sustainable housing options that are not as crowded. And so I think really we need to work on how do we equip all of us, including our leaders, with tools to diagnose and treat long-term problems.
I think it's very well said, this idea that if the diagnosis is that folks aren't even diagnosing in the first place, I think is a very apt description of it. And Mussab, you started to sort of allude to this a little bit at the tail end of your initial comments, but would love to hear some more of your reflections on this.
Yeah, I don't think I can be as clinical as our medical student here. But I think for me, when I think about the way that we failed in global leadership, you know, historically, I think America has actually been a leader when it's come to international pandemics and supporting the World Health Organization, you know, setting up things like the UN. But, you know, right now we're kind of receding in that role. But at the same time, I think a lot of people in America need to wake up and smell the coffee, right? And it's this idea that American hegemony does not exist anymore. America is not, you know, this great country that's so far ahead of the rest of the world that everyone else is playing catch up. I mean, we're a country that has to rely on this global economy, right? Like, it's a set of dominoes, and any domino falls, it's going to have an impact on everybody. And I think especially when you look at COVID-19 and the way that, you know, America in particular failed, it was a lack of learning from, you know, other countries that had dealt with this issue earlier. I mean, a great example is you look at New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand, you know, months ago was at a position where they hadn't had a single case of COVID in over 150 days. And so, you know, we're in a position right now where, you know, I think our country really needs to step up and say, listen, you know, how can we be that global ally? How can we listen to other people? Because so often I think America has been in the role of telling other people what to do. And I think, you know, once we start to recognize that, you know, it's a global community and it's an international network that's only going to work if we all get involved, I think that's the only way we're going to be able to move forward in terms of other international crises. I mean, this pandemic has really exposed how, you know, countries around the world are sometimes really just unwilling to help one another. And that's, I think it's really disappointing.
It is certainly quite disappointing. So I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on why young leaders are so important right now and the unique role that you see youth leadership playing in making the change that the world needs. Vongai, back to you.
Yeah, I really like Mussab's point about sort of a lack of teamwork, which I think young people do spectacularly well because they're just so hyper connected with each other, and their activation energy to reach out to other people, to organize and mobilize is very low. And so I've seen initiatives just be born out of a simple text message or, you know, LinkedIn message, and that's something spectacular, which I wish would also be rippled effect into higher levels of office, where we're bringing people to the table to discuss and debate and tackle issues. Another thing I think young people do well is that they're not afraid to try and fail. So they're willing to experiment with a solution and then not necessarily fail completely, but realize something isn't working and then quickly respond to the issue. And I think that resilience it allows you to try different solutions and ultimately come up with a very strong one. I think sometimes there's resistance to change the status quo, but youth leadership can really say, no, it's okay, we've experimented and we've tested this, and we're able to say what worked and what didn't, so that we can maximize what worked and minimize what is not.
Mussab, would love your reflections here.
Sure. I agree with Vongai. Like, I think the idea that, we all grew up in a world where essentially, I think almost everyone in Gen Z grew up in a world where the first iPhone came out before they turned 13, right? So essentially, they've always grown up in like the world of smartphone. And I think what's also really interesting to me is, young people just approach things differently. When you're older and you're used to status quo, I mean, it's very easy to be in a system that works for you, right? Because if you get a little bit of power in that system, suddenly you're like, maybe it's not so bad. It's working for me, and so we don't have to change it. But I think that the thing that I really like about young people is, usually it doesn't even matter what their background is, or what, like, their wealth or like their backgrounds. They're willing to go out and say, listen, like, we're willing to make change happen. So historically, you look at things like the Soweto uprisings in South Africa, right? You look at the dine-ins during the civil rights movement. I mean, these were young people who led those charges and said, listen, like, we want change to happen. And I think, like, for a more local example as well, one of the things we, like my nonprofit did during COVID is we ran a session on civic engagement. And at the end, we had teams that were formed that were focused on COVID-related issues that they saw in their community. And the issues that came up were issues that I don't think a lot of people were thinking about. So there's this idea of, like, building a community fridge. And so, we have one in Jersey City now where we're looking to build another one. It's every day it's being used. We're looking at issues like teenage mental health. I mean, this is a enormous issue during COVID, right? I mean, I have kids who message me on my Instagram almost daily that talk about, the sort of damage that's being done through virtual learning, not having those social interactions. But it's something that doesn't really, like, it flies under the radar for people who are generally looking at COVID response, PPE, supplies, equipment, et cetera. And so I think for us, it's important to, look at the history and start understanding that it's important to have young people as decision makers, right? Not just young people who are, just your token young person on the board who sits there, doesn't even have a vote, and is basically there so you can show diversity or show that you're interested in youth involvement. But you need young people who are, who have a say and who you're willing to listen to as organizations.
Yep, really interesting, and of often hidden or under-acknowledged challenges that are out there, and the idea that we need to use all insights from all members of the community and leaders at all levels and of all ages to surface them, but also to address them, I think is incredibly important. And I'd love to hear both of your reflections on some examples of youth leadership, whether it's during the pandemic specifically or just generally happening now, that you think are great examples that you look to for inspiration, but also that you think our audience can learn to and learn from as well. And to the extent that you think that some of them are also stepping in on some of these under acknowledged and under sort of addressed issues, I think that'd also be really interesting as well. So please, Vongai, love to hear about that.
Absolutely. In response to the mental health issue Mussab pointed out, I know a good friend who works on an initiative called Peer Minded, and it was born in part before the pandemic, but she intensified her work during the pandemic because she wanted to provide peer-to-peer wellness partners, training these listeners to really meet the need that was there, people feeling lonely, but not necessarily having access to mental health care, which in different countries can be very expensive or unavailable or even stigmatized. And so I really admired how she accelerated her plan, but very responsibly as well, to make sure the initiative was still sustainable in order to realize the project, but also respond to a COVID-19 related need. And I think a second one that's very timely in terms of civic engagement, there is a classmate of mine who's helping to mobilize medical students to make sure they know how they can get their votes in time, regardless of how they're voting, and making sure that they feel equipped with the knowledge that to lead in through their voting as well. So those are my two.
Yeah, really interesting. Great examples. Mussab, how about you?
Sure. So I think the first one, the name of the organization is slipping my mind. But I had a friend who, when the pandemic originally started, basically worked smarter than every government procurement department in the country, and essentially was able to certify and deliver PPE to multiple counties, municipalities, states across the country. And I thought that was just incredible. The fact that, using the internet, using scraping tools, using, connections that they had in China, they were able to leverage all of that in a way that, people who work full time for the government were not able to do. And I think that's just incredible. And it shows you, sort of innovation that young people have. I think the second one for me is also going to be a civic engagement one. I think there's been a lot of young people who have, launched initiatives. I think 18x18, which was Yara Shahidi's initiative for getting young people to vote. I think what people don't realize is that age group, 18 to 24, 18 to 35, is the lowest voting age group. Like, they vote the least, and they're the largest populace. So if they just started voting in their interests, you could potentially see major changes that would happen across, electoral districts.
Absolutely, and as an old political campaigner in me really thinks that some of the trends you'll see in that regard will be really fascinating, and really is a moment for innovators and entrepreneurs to really respond to. I think there's so much there. I think we've all seen how in the pandemic so much has been accelerated or changed for people, for institutions, for society. So everything from people are ordering their groceries online at rates they never did before, to shifts to different kinds of office space arrangements and telehealth. And then also individuals are making very different choices in their lives, or very accelerated choices in their lives. So I'm curious, both in your own personal leadership journeys and in some of the trends we've been talking about here, what has accelerated or what has changed in your leadership and in some of what you've observed out in the world when it comes to young leadership in the world when it comes to the pandemic? Vongai, start with you.
Sure. So, sorry, just to clarify, what has changed in terms of the way people are leading in the pandemic versus before?
So what maybe has been accelerated that might have you thought might happen 10 years from now, or perhaps what has really, and whether that's in you personally or that you've observed out in the world when it comes to youth leadership?
Sure. I think just the response to calls to action. I think usually we're accustomed to seeing these injustices like food insecurities or the climate change crisis or racial injustice. And I think people are no longer saying, oh, it's okay, I'll just look at it. Their young leaders are saying, no, I need to do something about it today. And I think that's coming from the realization that with the pandemic, we don't necessarily have a long time always to tackle these problems before they start to haunt us. And I've seen so much of that, like the initiatives Mussab and I mentioned, born out of the pandemic and continue to be. I know people are trying to provide, like particularly for school children who can no longer access lunches in school, like how can we mobilize grocery stores that have extra food anyway and meet those with the children that need it? And so I think part of it is being at home and, trying to find ways to connect and relate to people, but it's resulted in marvelous actions, and I hope they continue even post-pandemic. I also think it's given people some time to stew on what the current status quo is of the world and whether we're satisfied with that or not. And there are things we are doing well. Like I don't want to, I don't want to say that there aren't, because they are. But what else can we add to mobilize, to take charge? And so, yeah, I think those would be the two.
And Mussab, how about you?
I especially liked Wongai's last point, about this idea of, ideas stewing in people's minds. And I don't want to harp on capitalistic society too hard, but it's this idea that, people on a day-to-day basis, it's hard to get free time to really just think about the way the world is functioning, right? I mean, on a day-to-day basis, I know it's been months, but if you, think back to your life a year ago, I mean, you wake up, you're going to work, you have your daily routine, you go home, there's a couple extracurricular things you're doing here and there, and then that's it. It's just a cycle that repeats. And I think what the pandemic really did is it put a pause to everything. Even people who were working from home, right? The amount of work for majority of sectors across the country, across the world, was much slower, and people had a lot more time to spend with their families, a lot more time to really think about what was happening at a time when there were also global issues that were arising, as one guy mentioned, racial injustice issues that were arising. People really started to see food insecurity as like a really big issue. And I think that what this pandemic has really done is it's opened a lot of people's eyes to the sort of inequity that exists. And education obviously is like very close to me, and I think about that a lot because we knew this pandemic was here in March, and we ordered tens of thousands of laptops that early. In September, there were still kids without laptops. So you had kids who, for months on end, had no opportunity to get an education. And I think about how unfair that is and how unjust that is. And at the same time, I think about how if more people just started to look towards instead of individual benefit, societal benefit. And I think that's really what the Resolution Project is all about, right? It's this idea of launching social ventures or launching creative ideas that are here to change the world and here to make the world a better place. And so I think that I've gone on a really long trail here, but I think I am optimistic that post-pandemic, people still will be more conscious towards issues that are occurring in our society, even if they weren't before.
I agree. Now we're getting near to the end, so do just a couple more questions here. I want to just jump back to your respective journeys, and would love each of your reflections on two questions, one retrospective and one prospective. What have you seen as being the critical success factors in your own leadership journey, and what do you imagine some of the next chapters might be for your own journeys, leadership journeys as well? And so, Vongai, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think one item I would say in hindsight was I jumped in to the deep end a lot. And so I fully acknowledge that I don't have all the skills necessary, but I also know that there's a possibility that I can learn them. And so jumping into a project and seeking those skills, some of which have been definitely facilitated by my guides in Resolution Project and other mentors that I have had across the years. So nurturing that spirit of fearlessness in a sense, but responsible fearlessness. And that has allowed me to take part in things I never thought I could do, like starting a social venture or getting involved in university governance. And now, helping to address some of the inequities we have in vaccination rates in California. And so all of that definitely couldn't have done it without a bit of bravery and courage. And I think moving forward, I think I'm looking forward to more of those experiences, but also knowing that I have a tendency to ask, okay, what's next? And I think that has also allowed me to grow from initiative to initiative and really consolidate my skills along the way. I started in education, and increasingly I'm finding the ways education are intersecting with my medical career. Like, I'll give an example. I started recently working on a food insecurity project because a lot of pediatric patients who come into the clinic actually don't have good sources of food, and some of the advice is to, have 3 good meals a day, and that's really challenging to do when you don't have sources of meals. And so using my love of learning to understand what that environment is like, and hopefully in the future intersect that with a solution, along with some great mentors who are already physicians in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. And that what you're describing there, the intersection of different challenges around, for example, health and food insecurity, and they're so closely tied together. I feel like so much of the solutions that we're going to see in the world will think about multiple challenges at the same time and what it means to address those. So I think that's a fantastic example. Mussab, how about you?
Sure. So I think going off what Vongai was saying as well, there's a quote I really like by Muhammad Ali where he says, "He who's not courageous enough to take risks will not accomplish anything in life." And it's this idea that, you have to take risks. Like, I think, again, it goes back to this conversation about the status quo. If everyone is just satisfied with the status quo, there's never going to be any change. And so people have to be willing, to shake up the status quo, rock the boat, take the risk, do things that are unpopular, because those are the things that are really going to make the most change. I mean, you look at, so many ventures in our society that have, grown massively across the world. I think Khan Academy is like a great example. I mean, this guy quit his job at a hedge fund to launch an online tutoring platform, and for months on end had no funding until, one day he got a check that like saved his mortgage and saved his marriage essentially. But it's stories like that you have to be willing to take those risks. You have to be willing to believe in your ideas. You have to be willing to say, listen, you know what? If there's something that you're passionate about, if there's an injustice that you care about, what are the steps you're going to take to fight for those injustices? So for me personally, I think when I think about my long term and what I want to do next, I like this whole idea of working in the intersection of education and civil rights. So I remember growing up when I was in second grade, they shut down all the water fountains in our district, and so this is a district of 30,000 kids. So they shut down all the water fountains, and it was revealed that we had lead in our water fountains. Now, that was when I was in second grade. Today, I'm 23 years old. We still haven't fixed that issue. And that to me is, that's a civil rights issue. Like, kids should have access to clean drinking water. Like, kids should be able to drink from the water fountains in their schools. But that's essentially where I think I want to go in terms of, fighting for those injustices.
Please do. I very much hope you do that. To wrap here, for a final question, maybe just a minute apiece, we have an audience of young leaders and those who believe in young leaders and the power of youth leadership. Would love it if you could share a brief call to action to the group to get them fired up about ways that they themselves can demonstrate their leadership and how they can support those. Vongai, start with you.
I would say don't be overwhelmed by the problem. Find your footing, your positionality, and your privilege. I know we usually frame that as a very negative word, but acknowledging your privilege doesn't have to be. And what it allows you to do is to realize the places in which you have leverage and how you can combine your leverage with other people's to really impact it. Because you're going to have the privilege regardless. And so might as well, use it to address something you're passionate about. So I would definitely say that. A second tip, I think, is from a book I'm reading, is make a checklist. And it sounds really simple and silly, but I think checklists help to, allow you to perform that exercise of evaluating in your environment. Like, what are you happy about? What are you unhappy about? And then once you have that list, you can decide, okay, what do I do about it now? And you can make another list to address those problems. So checklists are great.
I checked a few things off my checklist just before we all got on here. It was very, very satisfying. Mussab, how about you?
Yeah, I think the best advice I could give to, youth people in youth leadership positions or supporting youth leaders is this idea that at every point, someone was always too young, someone was always too experienced. There were ideas that were always considered too radical or considered impossible. And, there were circumstances that people faced where they thought they'd never make it out, or they thought that, an idea was meant to fail. And I think it's that sort of framework that we have for 99% of the things that are happening in our life, right? Like, everyone kind of has this fear of jumping in and taking that risk. But, keep that in mind. Like, everyone was, in a position where they were unsure, and everyone was in a position where they had no idea what was going on, and they try to figure it out. So I think people should just be willing to jump in and make it happen.
That's great. Very inspiring words from both of you on this panel. To Vongai, to Mussab, thank you for this. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for sharing your experiences and perspectives with all of us tonight. With that, I'll hand it back to Mariella.